I would like to excuse Mrs. Eurpean. I will not do that just out of politeness, but also because she played a fundamental role in the fact that today Brussels can be rather proud in the field of passive houses and the progress made in the last few years. 10 years ago, Brussels was the worst pupil in the energy efficiency for the buildings. The city of Brussels is made of buildings where lots of energy losses are due to buildings in the Brussels region. So it was very important to work on energy performance of the buildings, and this policy was started in 2004. Evelyn Eurpean was already a minister in charge of energy at that time, and so she started an ambitious policy in Brussels back in 2004. Before that, out of the 470,000 housings in Brussels, the majority of these buildings were buildings with major energy losses. Then several proposals and several actions were put in place, so we changed the trend, and we now have a much better position. We are amongst the most ambitious cities in this field. In 2009, there was a new government after 2004, and Evelyn Eurpean was again in charge of energy issues. I became in charge of housing, social housing in particular. And in the government statement, that's the text that commits the government for a 5-year period. It is so we have several objectives, very important objectives for energy efficiency, amongst which the fact that public authorities, as of 2010, could commit themselves to passive standards for new constructions and for refurbishment projects. So one of the first actions that I lead as Minister in charge of housing is to make sure that all new buildings of social houses for the less favoured people in Brussels be in accordance with the passive standards, and all refurbishment work should also follow at least the low energy standard. And I say that's the minimum because if we stick to the budgets granted to these policies, we can improve and go even further in energy performance. Of course, we do it as well, which means that today we have 860 new projects that are being built, and we have a bit more than 2,300 passive houses in the field of social housing in particular. It was not easy at the start to convince different stakeholders to move in that direction. And at the same time, it was important to share this measure as being an essential measure in the field of collective responsibility and impact on pollution, but it is also an extremely social measure in a sector that needs to be attentive to the cost that every household has to spend or to pay every month for the heating. We have that situation in Brussels, and it's probably the case in many cities in Europe, where people would pay more for the heating than for the lease of the flat. So this was a fundamental argument to make this qualitative leap. And what is interesting is that after a first initiative related to additional costs of passive houses, we now have the piece of evidence that the additional cost is more and more limited, it's decreasing, and it's almost now close to the reference price. It is also an essential element, and when we proposed this political choice, we said, well, but the public authorities, we must be a role model. We must be exemplary. We must be a role model. If we ask the private sector to go in one direction at a given moment in time, we have to do that before them. We have to anticipate. And by deciding to build everything passive as of now, even if the measure will be compulsory in 2015, only it's a way to give a signal. We do that, and we will share the know-how with you. It is also a way of preparing different professionals and different trades to be ready by 2015. And I was not there to attend your discussions today, but I'm happy to know that there's several people in charge of the construction sector who were quite reluctant or afraid a few years ago, and this can be quite legitimate, are much more open today. And if I heard it well, if I understood it well, they say that they could be ready by 2015. So this is also one of our objectives. And this is what we had in mind to progress. Another essential aspect is the use and the conditions for that technique to succeed. Because starting this operation and running the risk of failing, and the failure could be a bad example, so that was quite risky as well. And this is why we've decided to be as cautious as possible. We've decided to use accompanying measures that are essential indeed. And the first point is about the users of these housing units. We see that people who lived in the innovative passive houses, the tenants, are now real ambassadors of these techniques. They promote these passive housing units to other tenants. And again, we are talking here about very low income people. Now, sometimes people say, well, passive houses, that's nice for the rich people, so for those who have a cultural level. And we do just the opposite. We share the best techniques and the best performances with the people who have most difficult social situations. And these people become ambassadors to promote these types of housing units to other types of tenants, other people who will live in these units. And next to that, we have to organize training sessions. If we want this work to be structural work, we don't want this to be just a temporary action. It is extremely important to take structural measures like the training sessions that we have to organize with the different public companies that build these houses. If we don't have responsible people, competent people, skilled people who can give a follow-up to these type of construction sites, it's not going to work. So we need to work on the training of technicians as well, those who are going to maintain the systems. It is not enough to have a building, to have a building built. You need to think about the follow-up and the aging of the building. You have to think of the problems that might pop up in the future. So it's essential as well to be well trained, with high quality training. We also need to have guidance or support initiatives for the passive or low energy initiatives. We also need to work on data collection for databases, statistics that will be used by the private sector in the future. And then, you mentioned it, it's the commissioning principle with a minimum period of normal functioning. This is also essential if we don't want to consider that the only thing you have to do is to deliver a building with some requirements that have to be met on a certain day. But it's also the blower door test in order to have to be able to control the results, and not just a theoretical analysis at the start. So these are important elements that we've been careful about, and that we will put on the private sector's table so that they can share the know-how that we are building now at public level, and that will be used by the other sectors as well. So that's it. Evelyn Uttebroek could have given more details regarding her own competences because she's still the Minister of Energy and Environment. She's extremely active. She wants to build an alliance between environment and employment, the environment and the economics, where the construction sector is an extremely positive element. So there again, we are changing the trend. As said, that people might have thought that passive houses were for the rich people. Another caricature is to say that environmental decisions are against employment or economic development. Here again, it's just the opposite that is taking place. We want better performances, and that is going to support jobs and economic development with new training sessions, new jobs, and there is scarcity of labor in Brussels, but these new models might bring some new solutions. So this is a very interesting alliance as well. Alliance between the energy targets, the environmental targets, and the economic targets in terms of employment and vocational training that are extremely interesting, and it's important for public authorities to have a collective ambition there. I'm going to stop here and congratulate once again the organizers of this workshop, this international workshop, and once again I would like to say that we are proud to show today that it is possible to change the trend, that public authorities do have that possibility with the cooperation of the private sector. It is indeed possible to change the trend. In 10 years ago, we were the bad pupils in the class. Now we are amongst the most ambitious. We want Brussels to be the capital of sustainable development, and the fact that we have measurable, concrete and positive performances is going in that direction. Thank you.